Everyone, my name is Tanya Mateo. I'm the founder of Interpremet.com, and in this video, I'll provide a brief overview of Kohlberg's theory of moral development and how it can help medical interpreters make ethical decisions. I'll use examples of common challenges and ethical dilemmas that interpreters face on the job to examine them through Kohlberg's eyes. I believe that understanding Kohlberg's theory can improve moral reasoning flexibility, increase critical thinking, and serve as a reflection tool for medical interpreters and many other professions. But what's exactly Kohlberg's theory of moral development? Let's first talk about who was Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg was a 20th century American psychologist best known for his theory of moral development. He built on Jean Piaget's research on moral judgment and identified 3 levels and 6 stages of moral reasoning that people go through as they age. Kohlberg reached this conclusion about levels and stages after conducting research in which he interviewed children and teenagers who were presented with moral dilemmas through stories and asked whether or not they thought a particular behavior was right or wrong. Kohlberg was more interested in the thinking process behind their moral judgment than in their response. The Heinz Dilemma is one of the best-known stories Kohlberg told children during his research. Let's read it. In Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it costs. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered a drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate and broke into the men's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? The children were then asked whether Heinz should or should not have stolen the drug. Kohlberg classified their responses into the following moral reasoning levels and stages. Let's see what each stage consists of. In stage 1, morality is imposed by figures of authority, and they hand down rules that children must follow in order to avoid punishment. A child may respond that Heinz should not have stolen the drug because it's against the law, and Heinz could face punishment. What the authorities allow and whether or not Heinz is punished determine whether or not an action is right or wrong. Children at stage 2 recognize that there are multiple points of view, not just the one handed down by authorities. As a result, each individual can select the viewpoint that best suits their needs or is personally satisfying. For example, a child may respond that Heinz could steal the drug if he wanted his wife to leave, but he didn't have to if he wanted to marry someone else. Children may also think in terms of fair deals, as in, if you do something for me, I'll do something for you. For example, if Heinz steals the drug, his wife may someday repay the favor. Throughout this video, I'll use the following interpreting scenario: interpreter stand by, and examine it from Kohlberg's perspective at each stage. This can help internalize what each stage consists of and evaluate the interpreter's behavior. Keep in mind that at this point, I'm not saying what you as an interpreter should do in this situation. I'm only describing what an interpreter might think, say, or do in this situation, using each stage of moral reasoning. Let's read the interpreting scenario. interpreter standby. A medical interpreter is interpreting over the phone for a Spanish-speaking patient and a primary care doctor. The doctor asks the interpreter to stand by and start speaking in Spanish to the patient. However, the patient has a difficult time understanding the doctor since the doctor has limited Spanish proficiency. The interpreter notices this, but remains on standby as the provider instructed. When we answer this question using level 1 reasoning, should the interpreter have or have not done that? And a level 1 interpreter will say that interpreters should follow the doctor's instructions because doctors have more authority and expertise than patients and interpreters during a medical encounter. Doctors prescribe medication, educate patients, and give treatment. Often, they have more information about a patient than interpreters because they have interacted with them more frequently over a long period of time. And they call interpreters when necessary. So the provider is the person in charge of the encounter. As a result, interpreters should defer to them. Furthermore, an agency may instruct its interpreters to always follow the medical provider's instructions. Otherwise, the interpreter may receive a complaint from the doctor or fail their quality assurance review, which may result in a reduction in bonus benefits or work hours. To avoid these negative consequences, an interpreter could decide to stand by. In stage 3, children, now in their adolescence, move away from seeing morality as simple deals and the what is it in for me position. Instead, they begin to value social approval from others and strive to be the good boy or good girl by living up to social expectations and rules of good behavior. In Heinz's scenario, respondents could say that Heinz should have stolen the drug because that's what a good husband would do to save his wife. Or they could say that stealing the drug is wrong and other people will think of Heinz as a criminal. Let's do our analogy with interpretation. At this stage, an interpreter will consider what the professional community will expect a good interpreter to do in the interpreter standby scenario. These expectations may vary depending on the community the interpreter is part of, but the interpreter will conform to those expectations, whatever they are. Let's say the interpreter is a member of a medical interpreting association, has taken several of their online webinars, and participates in Facebook group discussions about ethical dilemmas. They recall from conversations with colleagues that whenever someone in the encounter requests that you not interpret, the recommended action is to remind all parties of the interpreter's responsibility to convey all messages accurately and completely. So the interpreter chooses to do so because that is what their community will consider a wise decision. This interpreter can also consider how their intervention or lack of thereof may affect their relationship with the patient and the doctor. If the interpreter does not intervene, the patient may believe they were not assisted properly by the interpreter. If they do intervene and tell the doctor that their Spanish isn't fluent enough, the doctor may interpret that as challenging their authority, and this could create conflict. So the interpreter picks a side. If one side is right, the other one is wrong. For example, if the interpreter sides with the doctor, they believe the patient should have advocated for themselves. And if they side with the patient, they believe the provider is wrong for attempting to communicate in a language they are not fully proficient in. In summary, the interpreter's actions are motivated by maintaining good interpersonal relationships with either the patient or the doctor and adhering to the rules of their community. They view things from a dualistic perspective, good or bad, and choose to be on the good side. One of my criticisms of this reasoning will be that it reinforces black and white thinking and limits the interpreter's ability to make better decisions. But I will go over all the objections of Kohlberg's moral theory and how it applies to interpreters in a separate video or blog post. In stage 4, the focus is placed on respecting the law and the authorities and fulfilling one's duty to maintain the social order. If everyone broke the law when they felt like they had a good reason, we will live in chaos. Respondents in stage 1, which is obedience and punishment, may also say that stealing is wrong, but they cannot elaborate further than it's against the law. Whereas respondents in stage 4 can see how Heinz actions affect society as a whole. An interpreter looking at the interpreter standby scenario from stage 4 perspective may think about established codes of ethics and standards of practice, as well as US language access laws, from which they can conclude that the provider erred in refusing to communicate through the interpreter and speaking to the patient in Spanish, despite their limited language proficiency. And the interpreter erred in choosing to stand by instead of intervening to ensure accurate communication. For the following reasons: not providing an interpreter to patients with limited English proficiency is considered language discrimination and prohibited under several US laws. If all physicians spoke to the patient in a language they were not proficient in, medical care will be negatively impacted as doctors and patients wouldn't be able to understand each other. This results in poor communication that could lead to clinical errors and potentially malpractice lawsuits. Not communicating through an interpreter goes against established best practices by professional associations, as well as physicians and medical interpreters' codes of ethics alike, such as those published by the AMA for physicians and the NCIHC, IMIA, and CHIA for medical interpreters. While stage 4 respondents respect the law and want to maintain social order, stage 5 respondents recognize that laws can conflict with our moral outlook. They see laws as shared agreements or social contracts for the benefit of everyone in society, rather than as unchangeable, rigid rules. Although different social groups may have different moral perspectives on the law, most people will agree on 2 points. There are certain basic rights that need to be protected. In Heinz's case, some respondents may say that the wife's right to life is more important than breaking the law, and there are democratic procedures that can be used to change laws. For example, unfair laws can be changed by reaching a consensus through voting. Moral reasoning is guided by ethical principles, such as justice and respect, that take precedence over society's rules and laws. Individuals have internalized these ethical principles and follow them regardless of the punishment or rewards they may receive, because ethical behavior is seen as the right thing to do in and of itself. An important difference between stage 5 and stage 6 individuals is that stage 5 individuals only seek changes within the boundaries of the law, whereas individuals in stage 6 have a commitment to justice that includes a responsibility to disobey unjust laws. There have been many important activists who broke the law for what we now consider just reasons, like Rosa Parks in racially segregated Alabama in the United States, who was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white person as the law required. The following parts of this video will be a description of what an interpreter on the post-conventional level, that is stage 5 and 6, will be like and how they will respond to the interpreter standby scenario. The interpreter has very good knowledge of language access laws and standards of practice for medical interpreters, but they're also aware that these are not set in stone. They can be changed to respond adequately to the needs of the population they serve and help ensure proper interpretation. This interpreter believes that these changes can be made by using the means provided by the government and organizations that help improve medical interpretation services. At the same time, this interpreter knows that organizational and government processes alone sometimes aren't enough to bring about change. So the interpreter's practice is also guided by their independent understanding of what's best for interpretation in medical encounters based on the 4 principles of medical ethics: beneficence, do good; non-maleficence, do no harm; autonomy, the right of patients to make informed decisions about their care; and justice, treating all patients fairly. For example, when this interpreter is put in the scenario interpreter standby, they recognize that the doctor wanting to speak to the patient in a language they are not fully proficient in is problematic because it puts the patient's safety at risk by creating potential misunderstandings in communication that could lead to negative health outcomes. The doctor behavior also violates 3 ethical principles. Autonomy. The patient may be given wrong or inaccurate information about their treatment plan, medication, or any other clinical information, which hinders their ability to make informed decisions. Non-maleficence. The provider may be harming the patient if the language misunderstanding impacts the patient's health negatively. As an example, I will use the well-known case of Willie Ramirez, a baseball player in the 1980s who was misdiagnosed with having a drug overdose because doctors confused the words intoxicated and intoxicado. Intoxicado means food poisoned in Spanish. Doctors later on discovered Willie was having a stroke, but they did not provide prompt treatment. Unfortunately, Willie became quadriplegic as a result of this misdiagnosis due to an incorrect translation. And they're also violating justice. If the doctor doesn't communicate through a qualified interpreter when needed, the Spanish-speaking patient will have more difficulties understanding their clinical information and become more likely to suffer the negative consequences of medical errors due to mistranslations. This puts them at an unfair disadvantage when compared with their English-speaking counterparts, who are less likely to experience these problems. So this stage 6 interpreter would disapprove of how the interpreter in the interpreter standby scenario decided not to intervene, and as this is against the ethical principles I mentioned before. Additionally, this interpreter is also capable of putting themselves in the doctor's and patient's shoes. They can see how doctors in general don't mean to put the patient's care at risk. Most likely, the doctor wants the medical encounter to go a little faster or is overconfident in their language skills. Oftentimes, they are not aware of the complexities of language and interpretation or the legal requirement to communicate through a qualified medical interpreter. The patient, on the other hand, may have found it difficult to voice their concerns, not only because of the language barrier, but also because the doctor is perceived as an authority figure and they may not feel comfortable challenging their authority. The interpreter keeps these possibilities in mind to formulate their response. The interpreter will respond by politely refusing to stand by. Instead, they give the doctor a short and convincing explanation of why it is important to communicate through the interpreter, based on ethics, the law, and the agency's or medical center's policies as needed. For example, the interpreter could say, "I apologize, I'm not allowed to stand by. As I'm connected to this call, I'm required per agency policies and codes of ethics to interpret for this encounter. I will be more than happy to ask your questions to the patient to make sure everything is said accurately and completely and avoid any misunderstandings." The interpreter will also be transparent with the patient and let them know what the doctor asks the interpreter to do, and the interpreter responds to the doctor. The doctor may or may not comply with the interpreter's request. If they do, then the problem is solved and the interpretation session can continue as usual. If they don't, the interpreter can restate their request in a different way until they convince the doctor. But let's assume that the doctor, after going back and forth with the interpreter, decides to hang up the phone and call a new interpreter. In that case, the interpreter feels responsible for reporting that doctor because they deem their behavior unethical. They make sure to report through the most appropriate channels, for example, the compliance or quality assurance departments in the medical center or the interpretation agency. If the interpreter notices that despite filing complaints, the issues persist or are ignored by the agency or medical center, they seek alternative solutions, such as filing a civil rights complaint with a higher authority, such as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They could also advocate for good language access practices within their communities and professional organizations, or even start their own organization to solve one or more interpretation problems using all of the resources available to them. In summary, Kohlberg's theory of moral development divides moral reasoning into three levels that we progress through as we age: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional levels. On the pre-conventional levels, individuals base their moral decisions on self-interest and following the rules of the authorities to avoid punishment. On the conventional level, the emphasis shifts to having good interpersonal relationships by doing what society expects of a good person and obeying the laws that maintain the social order. On the post-conventional level, individuals begin to consider changes in the law that will benefit society, and sometimes even disobey the law when it violates certain ethical principles. But how can interpreters apply this knowledge in a way that it's meaningful to our jobs? Through practice exercises. And this is what we do at InterpreMed. We'll have an ethics club meeting on Saturday, March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will study Kohlberg's moral theory in depth using real-life ethical dilemmas and scenarios and giving you guidelines and solutions to respond to these ethical dilemmas. This will be extremely beneficial in bridging the gap between theory and practice in our interpretation jobs, so you can feel more at ease when facing challenging situations and respond professionally to them. There is also a chance that I will apply for continuing education units for the NBCMI and CCHI recertification for this ethics club meeting, but nothing has been confirmed yet. If I do, I'll make sure to update this video with the link to the CU course in the video description. So you are more than welcome to join our ethics club meeting by becoming a member at interpremet.com. Thank you so much for watching and see you soon.